Okay, today we are going to continue reading, and hopefully we'll finish reading. Hang on a second here. Okay, today we're going to continue reading, and we'll hopefully finish reading 2 Corinthians. Literally, as soon as I get started, the cats come out. They were quiet for the last hour, but as soon as I get started, here they come. I can't win this fight. I cannot win this fight. So we read the beginning of 2 Corinthians. We read the opening and then the section about him and going into his reconciliation with the church, and sending Titus to them and Titus coming back to them. And we skipped a section. He goes on to, he talks about like his connection with these people and their history together, and then he talks about sending Titus to them and then wanting Titus to come back and then kind of being uneasy when Titus didn't come back at the time that he thought or whatever. And he continues that thought he breaks off that thought in chapter 2 and then continues it in chapter 7. And so as we were reading it, we went ahead and just kind of connected that. We went down to chapter 2, verse 14 or something like that, 13. And then we broke off and went down to chapter 7, verse 5, when he picks that thought back up again. And we finished chapter 7. Then we went ahead and read the last 4 chapters, 10 through 13, to help set the context for the sorts of people who were causing the problems to begin with. And I discussed that it's hard for me to believe that 10 through 13 were written after chapter 2 and chapter 6. It's just hard for me to believe that. Now, we won't know the circumstances behind how this letter came to take this shape. Until we get there, we can ask him. So now today we're going to go back to chapter 2, starting in verse, we'll go ahead and start in verse 12. To kind of pick up the thought that we had that he was going on when he got interrupted. He interrupted himself and started talking about ministry, because that's what the subject matter of chapters 3 through 6 are going to be. This is called in some circles a Great Digression, because he completely stops his train of thought halfway through what we call chapter 2, and doesn't pick it back up again until chapter 7, and instead he sends the next chunk of the material, almost its own separate letter, talking about not something completely different, but still kind of talking about something that is off the track from what he had been talking about. He starts to talk about ministry and just the nature of ministry. Again, this could easily be its own separate letter, practically. I said before that 2 Corinthians kind of makes me think of 2 or even 3 letters combined into one. I think most likely, probably with this sort of thing, he wrote this letter in separate stages as he was making his way by land from Ephesus to Corinth, going up and around on the land route. And so he probably wrote the different parts of this letter at different times. Now, the other cats I got here again. They were quiet for an hour, but as soon as I get started on this, they have to come. They just have to. Like, it's just, they're drawn to me. They're drawn to my voice, I guess. As soon as I start talking and they hear me, they come out and they have to start crawling around on me. They just have to do it. Okay, so we're going to pick up here in chapter 2, verse 12. Now, when I went to Troas to preach the gospel of Christ, so he's going north from Ephesus to Troas by land. He's going the land route. And he found that the Lord had opened a door for me. I still had no peace of mind, because I did not find my brother Titus there. So he had sent Titus to Corinth with the harsh letter, whatever that may have been, and apparently also with instructions to continue overseeing the collection project that they were working on, to send a collection, a financial contribution back to the church in Jerusalem, this has been like a 2 or 3 year long project now. And Titus wasn't there. I guess he expected to see Titus in Troas, and Titus was delayed. And that concerned him. And just, in general, his friend was not there. And also, his friend is overseeing a financial collection project, so that increases the risk even more than usual. Because he did not find his brother Titus there, so he had no peace of mind. So I said goodbye to them and went on to Macedonia. That's going west across into northern Greece. So the Lord opened the door for him here. The Lord would have been fine with it if Paul had stayed there in trouble. Maybe that's even what the Lord wanted. At the very least, he would have been fine with it. So we know from here that even Paul, did not necessarily take advantage of every single opportunity the Lord afforded him. Because here he had an opportunity, and this is not, by the way, his first time in Troas. He had been there before, at least once in the past. Troas is actually where he would have met Luke. In the reading of Acts, Luke comes along in chapter 16 when Paul's group reaches Troas. Now Luke is actually in Philippi, and he has been there ever since Acts 16 when Paul and Silas left Philippi, and Luke stayed there, and he's been there ever since. And we will see him again when Paul goes back to Philippi. But apparently he was in Troas when he joined Paul to begin with. And so Paul has been there before. But he had an open door here this time. But he had no rest in his soul, so he could not go through that open door. And so he's going on to Macedonia to try to find Titus. And he does find him. And we'll read about that, which we already actually read about in chapter 7. So now he begins kind of a digression. We call it the Great Digression, where he talks about ministry. He's been in the process of talking about how difficult life is and how difficult ministry is. But here he talks about the benefits of it. But thanks be to God, who always leads us in triumphal procession in Christ, and through us spreads everywhere the fragrance of the knowledge of him. So triumphal procession is, he's using, this is a term that they would have all been very familiar with. He is basically talking about a victory parade. Here in the U.S., January 7th, 2025, the NFL regular season is just finished. And we're about to start the playoffs. In a month or so, we will have a Super Bowl champion. And a week or so after winning the Super Bowl, that team is going to have a victory parade. In this day and time, the Roman army would have victory parades whenever they came back after winning battles somewhere else. And this has been an ancient tradition that goes back long before Rome itself. So he's saying here that Christ is leading them around as a triumphal procession, as in a victory parade. And through us spreads everywhere the fragrance of the knowledge of him. For we are to God the aroma of Christ among those who are being saved and those who are perishing. It's two kinds of people. And we're an aroma of Christ amongst both of these kinds of people, those who are being saved and those who are not. To the one, we are the smell of death. Oh, I don't want to smell that. To the other, the fragrance of life. And who is equal to such a task? Now, this fragrance, my first thought when I read this goes back to the Old Testament when they would actually offer up incense to God, when they would burn their sacrifices. And the sweet smell of the sacrifice would go up figuratively into God's nostrils. And so this burning animal, which would be a horrible smell normally, is thus a sweet smell to God because it represents the purity of heart of the worshipers. But it's actually probably not the imagery he's tapping into here, even though he would be familiar with that. He's continuing on with his parade, a victory parade imagery, because the victory parade would have these kinds of incenses being sprayed around. And to the people who are celebrating, this was a glorious thing. It's a smell of victory and triumph and conquest. But if you're the poor sap in the cage that they're dragging along, it's a smell of your impending execution and death. If you're on the wrong side of the victory parade and you're the one whose conquest they're celebrating, This is not a good smell. And who is equal to this task? Unlike so many, hint, hint, the people who are causing their trouble with you, we do not peddle the word of God for profit. On the contrary, in Christ, we speak before God with sincerity, like men sent from God. That's what an apostle means, is one sent. So he is not a pay-for preacher. And this is an issue we've mentioned before, and like this was a problem for the Corinthian church. That they were bothered by the fact that he didn't let them pay him. Now to him, this was a very significant point, but it caused friction with these people. And they would have been used to these out-of-town traveling preachers coming and taking up residence inside cities and getting paid and getting sponsored. That would have been their custom. They would have been used to that. And he kind of subverted that by not letting them pay him. Are we beginning to commend ourselves again? Or do we need, like some people, letters of recommendation to you or from you? This goes back to one of the core issues that he had with the church about this idea of needing to be like properly recommended by the proper sources. Apparently, so he founded the church. He established his congregation in Corinth. He was there for 18 months. Then he went to Ephesus. And then at some point after he left, Apollos came. And Apollos left and went to Ephesus too. And at some point, apparently, Peter was there. And that led to that situation in 1 Corinthians where everybody was kind of following different apostles who weren't even physically present at the time any longer. And that seems to have kind of morphed since 1 Corinthians. That issue seems to have kind of switched from, declaring loyalty to certain apostles to declaring loyalty who weren't present. The apostles weren't in the city at that time. To declaring loyalty to teachers who were in Corinth and who were taking the place of these apostles and saying, well, if these guys, like Paul in particular here, wants to come back, he'll need to prove his credentials to us because we're fine without him. Something like that seems to have happened. You yourselves are our letter, written on our hearts, known and read by everybody. So you are the proof. You are the evidence that people can look at to establish our credentials. You show that you are a letter from Christ, the result of our ministry, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone, or scrolls for that matter, but on tablets of human hearts. So you are the evidence. You're all the proof we need to establish our credentials. You want to know whether or not we're a genuine apostle? You are the proof of that. Such confidence as this is ours through Christ before God. Not that we are competent in ourselves to claim anything for ourselves, but our competence comes from God. So it's not a self-confidence issue, it's a God-confidence issue. He has made us competent as ministers of a new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. Now he's going to talk here. He's going to use this opening he's created for himself here to talk about the law. Now, I don't think that Corinth had the same issues with Judaizers coming into the congregation as other places had. Paul had this group of people who followed him around. From the time he began his ministry in the Galatian churches until he got down to Achaia, in southern Greece, where Corinth was, he had this group of people who would follow him around from town to town and cause trouble. And there would be also these Judaizing people who would come into the church and at least appear, maybe they were genuine, but maybe they just were phony, to be Christians, and for the sake of convincing the Gentile converts that Paul had established to become circumcised and to adopt Judaism before they could become Christians. That doesn't seem to have been the case in Corinth. Now, these people were apparently Jews, and we read about that when we read through Paul's comparing himself to them in chapter 11, which we read last time. We read forward on that. So he's comparing himself to them, and he's listing their genealogical descendants descendancy from Abraham, so they apparently were Jews, but it doesn't seem as though they were really pushing, at least not that hard, for the Corinthians to get circumcised and all that kind of stuff. He does talk a little bit about this kind of stuff here, but I don't know if he's doing it because this was preached by these. I don't think these Judaizers, first of all, Corinth was where the Roman authorities had given the green light to the gospel. So like the charge of the Christian preachers preaching an illegal religion that the Jews tried to bring against the Christians in other places didn't work here. And secondly, I think the Corinthians were too idolatrous to really care. I mean, if these people are having difficulty about where to eat their meat, like I read about 1 Corinthians, they're not going to subject themselves to the discomfort and humiliation of circumcision as adult males. So I don't believe that the Judaizers were really pushing that. So I don't think he's really talking. He's going to kind of talk a little bit about that here, but I don't really think that's the issue. I think he brought this. I think he has this. I think he's continuing forward with this thought because he's mentioning. He talked about not needing letters, not needing someone. When Apollos came there, he had letters. For example, we read about that in Acts. He actually did receive a letter of recommendation that he provided. Not to say that Apollos was the problem here, but like that is the idea they're talking about here, and Paul is refuting his need for that because they are the letter. He doesn't need someone to write a letter approving him to these people because their very existence as Christians in Corinth establishes the genuineness of his apostleship. So that he's kind of building on that imagery, I think, here. He has made us competent as ministers of a new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. Now we'll read more about this. We read about this in Galatians, and we'll read about it in Romans. That the law brings death because all it could do is point out our wrongdoing. He's not going to go into a lot of detail about that here, but that's the idea behind the letter killing or the ministry bringing death. It's because all the law could do is point out when we failed. And that was a good thing. I mean, the law itself was good. Its standards were correct, but it could not help us keep it, and it could not do anything to fix the problem when we broke it. When we broke the law, we were condemned, and the law could not do anything about that. Plus, the law could not empower us to keep it. So that's why the letter kills. Now, if the ministry that brought death, which was engraved in letters of stone, on stone, came with glory, so that the Israelites could not look steadily at the face of Moses because of its glory. Now, this is referring back to when Moses would go into the tent by himself and have his private correspondence with God, and then he would come out of the tent and his face would be glowing in some way or another, and the people couldn't look at it, so he would wear a veil. That's what he's referring to here. And that is the ministry that brought death. Moses was giving them a law from God, which ultimately could not save them. It could not empower them to continue to live for it, to live by its standards. And so it could only bring death. It could not bring death. And if that was glorious enough that they had to hide themselves while he was glowing and covered in the glory, how much more is the next kind of glory going to be? So if the ministry that brought death, which was engraved in letters on stone, came with glory, so that the Israelites could not look steadily at the face of Moses because of the glory, fading though it was, will not the ministry of the Spirit be even more glorious? So if the lesser thing was glorious, how much more so will be the greater thing? If the ministry that condemns men is glorious, how much more glorious is the ministry that brings righteousness? For what was glorious has no glory now in comparison with the surpassing glory. Again, we'll read about this a lot in Romans, his next letter. We already read a little bit about it in Galatians, but Romans is pretty much going to be all about this for the most part. And For what was glorious has no glory now in comparison with the surpassing glory. And if what was fading away came with glory, how much greater is the glory of that which lasts? Therefore, since we have such a hope, we are very bold. We are not like Moses, who had put a veil over his face to keep the Israelites from gazing at it while the radiance was fading away. Every time he went out into that tent and came back out again, his face would radiate with his glory, but the glory would fade. We are not like Moses, who would put a veil over his face to keep the Israelites from gazing at it while the radiance was fading away. But their minds were made dull. So we're just reflecting God's glory all the time. And we don't need to hide it. The glory isn't fading away, and what's there doesn't need to be hidden any longer. But their minds were made dull, for to this day the same veil remains wherever the old covenant is read. So it's a figure. So Moses was literally covering his face, but it's now being applied figuratively to the people who are in the synagogues and in the temple and are reading the law of Moses, and they're still covering their face. They still are hiding themselves. It has not been removed because only in Christ can it be taken away. Even to this day, when Moses is read, a veil covers their hearts, so that they cannot withhold the all-surpassing glory. But whenever anyone turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. That's how you partake in this glory, is to turn to the Lord. Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And we, who with unveiled faces all reflect the Lord's glory, are being transformed into his likeness with ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. So we're not like Moses. The glory is not fading. We are reflecting God's glory, a far surpassing glory to the one that Moses had, and this glory is not going to fade and does not need to be hidden. But if you're going to hold on to the old way, your glory is going to continue to be veiled. What you could have access to the all-surpassing glory that does not need to be veiled and is not going to fade away and leads to life and not to death. But if you're not going to follow it, and if you're going to continue pursuing these other letters, and I think he also is referring to, he's using this example of the letter of the law of Moses and comparing that to the letters of recommendation that they want him to provide from some other source. So I think that's kind of the comparison here. I don't think we should necessarily read this to mean as though the Corinthian church itself was being overtaken by Judaizers. That doesn't seem to be the case, at least not to the degree that it was in other places. But I think he is using this extended imagery here to say that this letter of recommendation that you're looking for, this system of approval, it's the same thing that the Jews are looking for when they go to the synagogues and the temple and they hear Moses read. But their way of thinking is out of date. Okay? The surpassing glory that Moses had was temporary and limited and was not meant to be forever, as evidenced by the fact that his face would fade, the radiance would fade over time. It was a ministry that brought death and not life. It was a ministry that was temporary and not permanent. It was a ministry that condemned men instead of saving them. And even that was glory. That was glory. It had its own kind of glory. But for those who continue to go to the synagogues and read Moses and follow that, they are putting on the veil that covers up this glory that they could have if they were to take the veil away and exchange the old fading glory for the new all-surpassing permanent glory, where we reflect God's glory without needing to cover it, without needing to veil it, and without it fading away. A ministry that brings life and not death, that brings salvation and not condemnation. But these Corinthians, I don't think are doing that. I don't think they're going to synagogues or anything like that. But I think Paul is comparing their pursuit or their insistence on receiving these letters of recommendation to the Jewish pursuit of the law. It's like you're operating according to the old world system. You're operating according to the old fading glory that was never meant to last. And this goes back essentially to what we had the problem in the first letter, where they were pagans that came out of a pagan background, and that was compared to the Judaizers. Actually, that was in Galatians I'm thinking about. But the idea here is that their pursuit of letters of recommendation for Paul to establish his credentials, even though he was the one who first preached to them and established the congregation, is outdated and old-fashioned in the same way that the Jews' pursuit of seeking God's favor through the letter, through the law, is also out of date and old-fashioned.